Welcome to the Gravity Well podcast with me, Jenny Yeremy. I host the Gravity Well to celebrate and share the stories of people looking to empower others with the knowledge and skills required to reestablish stability in our communities. My mission is to work through heavy issues in conversation and process in order to lighten the load. I acknowledge that I live on the traditional territories of Treaty 7 and Métis Districts 5 and 6. The treaties and self-governance agreements established by Indigenous peoples were created to honor the laws of the land, maintain balance with nature, and give back to uphold reciprocal relationships. This knowledge and intention are what guide the Gravity Well conversations. I ask for genuine dialogue, real hearts, and openness to different perspectives. This is your invitation to find common ground with me. Positions taken by participants, either individually or collectively, do not necessarily represent those of the Gravity Well. This podcast is dedicated to the natural world, our children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, and all future generations. The Gravity Well is on YouTube and streaming wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you see and hear, remember to like and subscribe. Welcome to the studio, Tara. I'm so excited to have you with me. So Tara Russell is an outdoor and nature enthusiast. She's been with CPAWS since 2015. She has an honors degree in biology and a master's degree in philanthropy and nonprofit leadership. Tara is deeply engaged in multi-stakeholder work and community advocacy. Her expertise combines environmental policy experience with the understanding of nonprofit governance and management. She advocates for nature-based solutions and believes that prioritizing conservation of nature and land management will support biodiversity and strong communities going forward. Welcome, Tara. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thanks so much for inviting me on, Jenny.
What is your role at CPAWS, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm the program director for the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society Northern Alberta chapter. Our chapter really focuses on public land conservation from Red Deer north to the Northwest Territories border. And I've been actively engaged in caribou recovery and land use planning for the recovery of caribou habitat for more than 10 years now. This is where I started in my environmental nonprofit journey. Honestly, I have been engaged in the land use planning for the area that we're about to talk about since 2015.
It's such a pleasure to work with you, as we were discussing before we started, on the coal issue, something that is impacting all of us. And of course, with the waternotcoal.ca campaign going on, it's of utmost importance that we talk about those things. So I'm so glad to be in community with you, and now to be talking about my favorite topic, which is sub-regional planning. So can we start there, Tara? Can you help people understand what the purpose of sub-regional planning is, please, and what it seeks to achieve?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. So I believe it was back in the early 2000s, the government of Alberta recognized that there are a lot of demands for use on Alberta's public lands all across the province, and introduced the land use framework, which set out this intention to create regional land use plans in all of the major watersheds across the province. Regional plans are really large, and they're supposed to set this overall kind of direction of what type of land use is appropriate where and when. To really drill down into more local or regional issues on the lands, each region is also supposed to have sub-regional land use plans to provide a little bit more detail. These have been very, very complicated processes, but in 2019, the government of Alberta, as a way to address the rapid declines of caribou populations, set out an intention to complete sub-regional land use plans encompassing all of the endangered and threatened caribou populations and their home ranges across the province. So the sub-regional plan that we're going to be discussing today, and some of the other ones that are probably going to be coming out shortly in the future, the purpose of those initially was really to figure out how we can manage the different industrial uses and recreational uses on the landscape to improve caribou habitat in order for them to have a chance at surviving and recovering.
Yeah, and I had a fabulous conversation with Kennedy Halverson with respect to what the importance of caribou, for example, as a keystone species. And what she said to me, which has just stuck with me, is that they're emblematic species. So they represent an intact ecosystem. So when a species like woodland caribou suffer, the entire ecosystem is suffering and can ultimately lead to collapse if we do not follow these ecological markers, such as caribou population stability. Is that fair, Tara?
I think it's absolutely fair. They're both an umbrella species and an indicator species, so they are absolutely an indicator of our overall boreal forest and foothills forest ecosystem health. There are 15 woodland caribou populations across northern Alberta, and all of them are threatened, and we are at risk of losing them. They have very specific and very well identified and understood habitat requirements. They need, at a minimum, 65% of their home ranges undisturbed from industrial resource extraction, roads, seismic lines, well pads, forest cut blocks. They need 65% undisturbed, and they also need those mature old forests that provide them space to feed, calve, raise their young, and mate. And they need those intact as well. And this is very well understood, these metrics that we need to achieve for caribou to even have a chance at recovering. The requirements in the boreal forest are well understood, and that's a really good input into these land use planning processes.
Wonderful, thank you. And we were discussing just before we started, I was loosely involved in the Cold Lake sub-regional planning. So as you were mentioning, the idea is to have these regions be logical in terms of the activity and the let's say, habitat spaces. And now this plan, so this plan we're initially speaking about today is the Athabasca sub-regional plan, which now is overriding that plan I was involved with. Is that what you were explaining to me?
Yeah, so the government of Alberta released the South Athabasca sub-regional plan. It came out in draft in early January, and it's out for public engagement right now. And you're right, initially, a few years ago, they released the Cold Lake sub-regional plan, and this South Athabasca is now overriding the Cold Lake plan and combining it with the Wandering River sub-regional plan, which never was released in draft, but it did have a lot of multi-stakeholder engagement and input into what was supposed to be the Wandering River sub-regional plan. The Cold Lake sub-regional plan also had a very engaged and lengthy multi-stakeholder process informing what the outcome should be. CPAWS Northern Alberta had a seat on that multi-stakeholder table and engaged in good faith with long conversations with representatives from industry, from Indigenous communities, from the forest side as well. We haven't seen any of that engagement really reflected in this new South Athabasca sub-regional plan.
Yeah, being privy to that Cold Lake sub-regional planning document, to me, it was everything you need. It included all the areas of concern, the ways that we are using the landscape, the way we need to preserve the landscape. I thought it was just a brilliant thing. And the key piece that was in there from my perspective was to have sites on timelines. And we're going to get into that when we get into the details here. But I recall that sub-regional plan being precedent setting, the expectation that all the sub-regional plans would follow the lead of that. And the, what was the other one that was released at the time?
The Bistro.
And the Bistro, yeah. Mm-hmm. So those two both had sites on timelines and this expectation that there would be a concerted effort to follow the ecological requirements in the areas. Okay, so we've talked about what it is, the documents, and the broader implications of this document now that we are overriding what was done a few years ago with and 10 years in the making before that. these multi-stakeholder groups. And, I recall a person from the Alberta environment saying, if we don't do this, the federal government will have to step in and force us to do something meaningful. Would have been nice to see that, especially even at this point. But let's get into it. So you've done a guideline document for folks to help provide input, feedback to this document. So can you start by talking about the first section? So there's 4 sections in the document. Can you say, first of all, what you think is, over in the overall sense, what are you seeing from this document?
As I mentioned, the South Athabasca Sub-Regional Plan is open for public engagement and feedback. That closes on April 9th. And myself with CPAWS Northern Alberta, alongside our colleagues from the Alberta Wilderness Association, the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society, and Nature Alberta, we came together to create this engagement guide in hopes to help the public, or really anyone that's interested, be able to provide some feedback as part of that public engagement. These are very long documents, and the real challenge that I've seen with getting public feedback on these sub-regional plans is that the government of Alberta has not released any accompanying information about how this plan actually impacts species at risk, like caribou, which was supposed to be one of the goals of the plan, is to recover them. There is no information as part of the engagement on what the impacts to caribou or caribou habitat are, or really any other indication of how this plan could impact values that folks care about. So this is why we came together and put out this engagement guide, to really try to highlight what we see as the challenges and opportunities in this plan. And I will, preface is that it's mostly challenges in this plan. It does put the 2 boreal caribou populations, the east side Athabasca and the Cold Lake caribou populations, at further risk of being completely lost. The plan has removed the policy objective to recover caribou. So that is no longer an objective of the plan. And that's very clear from all of the provisions listed in it. Previously, there was agreement that restoring or maintaining caribou critical habitat to the minimum 65% required would be a goal of sub-regional plans. This is something we are obligated to do under Canada's Species at Risk Act, and this plan contains no intention or mention of achieving those caribou habitat goals. So really, that is our general impression, is that this subregion, which is completely covered by a forestry tenure, almost all of the in situ oil sands projects fall within this subregion. There's a lot of other oil and gas activity, and there's a lot of recreation activities here. So it's a really busy landscape, and the plan desperately needs to lower those levels of cumulative industrial disturbance and address the negative impacts of that. And it does none of this, according to our analysis. So the guide that we've put out kind of walks through the survey that the government of Alberta has put out for engagement, and helps guide folks to fill that out. It does nothing for caribou, and it doesn't even tell you that it does nothing for caribou. And that is really frustrating.
Right. Yes. Remembering that the entire purpose of this is to make sure that we are maintaining a stable ecology. That means we have enough water for the way we live, enough an ability for animals to have the food that they need to survive. There, as you said, the disturbance, every time we put a road, a seismic line, well, those are mostly the legacy seismic lines that are still out there, things that we have not properly recovered on the landscape. And you talk about this being the in situ oil areas. Some restoration of the stuff that is no longer producing would help alleviate any further development. But it does touch, the plan does talk about a number of exemptions. Is that correct, Tara?
Almost every good thing that is mentioned in the plan, reducing the number of primary roads. So those are like the high class roads that really result in long-term permanent development. They try to limit those and have other access to oil and gas infrastructure only be on transitional roads, which with the intention of those roads being restored. But any transitional road can be turned into a primary road if it's going to go access a resource. There is a change to the buffer around riparian areas, which could very significantly impact lakes, streams, rivers, waterways. It's a reduction in the buffer. And then within that buffer, almost every type of development is exempted from the buffer. So it really feels like functionally you could build anything right up to the stream side or lake side. So that is a repeated theme throughout the plan, is that it's like lip service to this thing that on the surface seems like it could be beneficial for the environment. And then we're also going to exempt in situ project areas from that requirement. We're also going to exempt existing or access for existing oil and gas production areas. It just is on and on and on. And then again, on top of that, there's no clarity on what these changes or exemptions could possibly mean for the recovery of species at risk. It is very clear throughout the whole plan that the only policy objective they are trying to reach is the doubling of oil and gas, and that is coming at the expense of any other value that could possibly be found in the region.
Can you remind me, I know you've mentioned that the expectation is to get to only 35% disturbance. Do you happen to know the actual disturbance number today? I know you said it's not in the document itself, but are you familiar with that, Tara? Do you know how much disturbance is on the landscape?
They initially made a commitment, which caused the start of this sub-regional planning process. And this was supposed to be the way that they were proving that they would recover caribou, was to create these sub-regional plans. They agreed to do this. That agreement unfortunately expired at the end of October this past year. They are completing the sub-regional plans that they agreed to, but they're no longer meeting any of the requirements that were outlined in that Section 11 conservation agreement between Alberta and Canada. But one of the good things that did come out of this was that they committed to reporting on the amount of disturbance in each caribou range. Less than 5% undisturbed habitat.
That sounds so correct to me. I remember it being around 95% disturbance. Yeah, thank you for that, Tara. So this is the significance of what is required for us to get back on track in terms of our ecological stability, is to reduce that number from 95% down to 35%. And I recall it being by 2060. Was that a meaningful date, or was that just what they thought they could achieve? Do you happen to remember that piece, Tara?
2060 would make sense because in order to be considered undisturbed caribou habitat, it has to be at least 40 years old. Like the forest has to be at least 40 years old. You can't do that overnight. You need 40 years. And when these plans were initiated, it was around 2020. So 2060 would be 40 years later, and that is when, if you initiated restoration on all of the undisturbed habitat, the earliest that you could achieve those habitat goals would be 2060. A lot of the plans, and something that CPAWS had been advocating for through this process, was to be meeting that habitat requirement within 50 to 100 years, with the most habitat coming back online, if you will, for caribou in that 40 to 50 year mark.
Showing the importance of getting on this as soon as possible so that you can have those long-term objectives be met.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a long way to go. I mean, as you asked, most of these ranges, these home ranges for caribou, are over 90% disturbed. There's so little undisturbed habitat remaining.
Right. Okay, thank you so much for that. So you mentioned that there are a lot of exemptions. You said it doesn't outline the current state. It doesn't have those figures in there, like you're saying. And then it gets into some of the specifics in there. So as you mentioned, it's talking about doubling oil production, but it doesn't talk about the water involved in that. Can you speak a little to that?
To me, like, there's very little in this plan that addresses the water use or contamination issues with doubling oil and gas. There is a small section, if I recall correctly, discussing putting the tailings issue onto a later or different water management plan. The entire plan is focused on doubling oil and gas without really addressing any of the environmental land or water concerns. One of the things that really strikes me in the energy development section is the cumulative disturbance parameters that it's attempting to achieve, where it does talk about restoring unproductive existing infrastructure, but there's no definition of what unproductive is. It seems like something that the companies can kind of self-define. And as well, there's no incentive nor consequences for restoring that. And so it has this lovely thought of reaching these cumulative disturbance parameters, but there doesn't appear to be any real mechanism to do that. And again, if there's no incentives or consequences to this initiative, then functionally it's not going to change in the area. I'll also mention that it does talk about, having these cumulative disturbance parameters that should be met in the go zone, in the slow go zone, and the restoration first zone, which I 100% agree. We absolutely need to have cumulative disturbance parameters. This is something that subregional plans should be doing. This is why they could be so powerful, is they have the ability to address cumulative disturbance on our very busy public lands. These metrics appear to be based on nothing. They are not based on an ecological threshold. I think they're just based on what they think might be out there in terms of unproductive footprint. And they've just said, if we just only address the unproductive footprint, maybe, then this is what we could achieve. So we'll make this the parameter. For our ecosystems, doing it based on what's possible or just the unproductive systems out there is useless. It's not meaningful to the environment. It's not meaningful for caribou. Why are we doing it?
So it sounds like they've looked at what is productive in terms of oil and gas and said we will basically commit to doing something outside of that. And that's it, not worrying about what the consequences are. Shocking. Well, not shocking, but very disappointing. And you also mentioned forestry in this. So in this document, which I will be sure to include when I share this episode, you talk about forest management objectives. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do want to first point out within the forest management objectives, there appear to be long-term deferrals. So what they've labeled as like CON in the maps, which I imagine is a proposed conservation area, just committing to a long-term deferral. Those appear to be in areas of high caribou use and high value biophysical habitat for caribou, which I think is a really good step. We should absolutely be conserving those remaining areas of caribou biophysical habitat. That conservation only applies to forestry. There's no provisions for preventing other types of industrial resource extraction from those identified areas. So I do think that that's a good step, but overall the plan lacks clarity on how, again, the proposed forest management will help achieve those caribou habitat recovery goals. It does appear that the forest harvest timing sequence included in the plan, just the harvest, puts the habitat disturbance above what caribou need in the first 40 years. There's, again, that hasn't been made clear in the plan. And then on top of that, there was no forest harvest timing sequence shared for areas outside of caribou range within the plan, which is confusing to me because the entire forest tenure covers the entire subregion. So that wasn't shared. I presume that there's forest harvest going on across the entirety of the subregion and that there's other biodiversity and wildlife values across the subregion.
So it mentions a need to be considering forest management to look after caribou habitats, but it doesn't explain how they will be doing that, what the plan will be to be actually staying within, again, ecological limits, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And it appears to actually go over ecological limits just with the forestry in the plan.
Alone. Oh my goodness. Okay. And then access management. So you speak about this a little bit for folks. Can you discuss that for me?
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the areas that I had really high hopes for subregional planning. again, I know I've repeated this a billion times, but public lands are really busy spaces, and the way that industry accesses the resources to extract is through a very lengthy road network. This has really large impacts on caribou. They don't tolerate roads very well. They can act as access for predators, and they kind of disrupt movement across ranges as well. So I think access management, by kind of looking at all the roads you have in a region and determining which ones you actually really need, which ones could be restored or removed, was a massive opportunity that has been completely lost in this plan. There is target road densities for each zone, which, similar to the cumulative disturbance parameters, they are not related to any ecological needs. So they haven't been addressed in any of those ways. As I also mentioned, there are different types of roads that they say they can have. So there's the primary roads, or the transitional roads, or temporary roads. The rules on what you can have a primary road, or if you need a transitional road, they feel really wishy-washy, and those are going to be really hard to adhere to. All of this is exempted if you have an in situ project area. None of the access management counts if you're in a project area. And I think the project areas cover about 20% of the whole subregion.
Yeah, it's shocking to see the amount of scarring on the landscape when you realize that. And that, it's funny, for years, my spouse has been saying to me, every time there's a road, it never goes away. And now I understand why that matters. He has an environmental background, by the way. So yeah, it's, and thinking about our impact, it does matter. I spoke with a rancher down in southern Alberta, and he was saying, come camping season, the water is impacted by human activity out there, both ATVing and fecal matter, for that matter, while we're out there. All of it matters, and our need to be a part of this story is really important. You also mentioned recreation and tourism. There is some restrictions for ATV access, but it's not broad enough. Is that right?
Yeah, I think this area, I mean, it's a really beautiful area when you kind of look past the immense amounts of industrial disturbance. There's lakes, there's rivers. It's classic boreal forest. And there is a commitment in the plan to have some more cooperative management and planning of recreation areas with Indigenous communities, which I think is a really good step. And there's like a little bit of mention of managing the recreation in ways that support caribou recovery and biodiversity, but similar to the rest of the plan, there's no teeth behind that. There's one area that was identified that is going to have timing restrictions for off-highway vehicle access. That should be expanded if it's important for caribou across all areas of caribou range. And there is really no clear limits on where that recreation and tourism development can happen. There's no basis of it for the needs of caribou or other wildlife or ecological needs. It's important that when we're considering recreation and tourism development anywhere in Alberta, that those impacts, like you said, on the waterways, on the public lands are considered. And I just don't see that reflected in this plan. But I also want to emphasize that most of the disturbance in this region is really caused by it being at the epicenter of the oil and gas industry. And I think that is also a pretty strong deterrent for recreation and tourism. But there's also a lot of people that live and work in this area that deserve to have good access to recreation opportunities. So I think there's, again, in this plan, just a missed opportunity to be considering any of that. And we're really just prioritizing that intention to double oil and gas over all other values in the area.
Right. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about conservation areas. So it is mentioned in here a little bit, and it sounds like a positive, but again, we've just been talking about exemption after exemption after exemption. And I do want to say, because you highlighted something really important here. Yes, we have an impact, but we have to recognize the scale of the industrial impact is much more severe, much more significant. If we're looking at this from an effective ecological effort, it has to be at that industrial scale. That has to be the effort that's made. But let's talk a little bit about the conservation areas that they've added into this plan.
I was really excited to see conservation area boundaries outlined. And there was, again, this intention and commitment for that to be an Indigenous-led conservation area within the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range, which is within the traditional territory of the Cold Lake First Nation. I think having those lines down is excellent. I think that they should be managed for caribou conservation, and I want them to be effective in safeguarding the environment and protecting those species at risk. This is a complicated one. The proposed conservation area is within the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range, which is managed by the Department of Defense for Canada. It's quite literally an active air weapons range. It also has in situ oil sands projects within the air weapons range, and there are many complicated layers. Land designation in the region. I think one of the parts of this proposed conservation area that's disappointing to me is the intention that it can permit both the renewal of and consideration of new activities to allow oil and gas extraction from the conservation zones, and that all of the provisions in it don't seem to differ from the adjacent GO zones, if you will. It would be really interesting to see how this plays out, because again, this is within the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range, which comes with its own development restrictions. What's disappointing is that there appears to be no intention for this area to prioritize species at risk. I do hope that it truly ends up being an Indigenous managed and conservation area, and that the Cold Lake First Nation really has the majority say in how that land is managed. And given all the other exemptions in the plan, I don't have a lot of faith or hope in that being the truth.
Yes, again, like you said, it's not enough to have good intentions. So you need to see a plan in order for things to actually feel like they are genuine. Okay, so let's talk about the economic impacts. So now we're getting into section 3 here. So you guys rightly offer some comments around the economic impacts, if you would, please.
Economic activities that permanently and irreversibly change the environment, like those that will result in the loss of a species like caribou or irreparably damage waterways, don't actually effectively support long-term economic opportunities for the region. They put all life at risk. This plan is very short-sighted, and the intention of sub-regional plans is that they are thinking long-term. So I don't think that this does a service for Albertans or for Canadians.
Yes, you're right. It is a very good statement that you rightly make, because using water beyond what the earth has the capacity to return, for example, is going to cause irreversible damage that we will suffer for decades, if not centuries, if we're not careful. You know, I sit in on these watershed council meetings and hear exactly what you've said throughout this recommended answer guide for folks, is that this plan is not going to work, and we will be facing ecological collapse unless we do something significantly different. So thank you for making that statement. Is there anything else under section 3 you wanted to highlight for anyone?
Yeah, section 3 of our guide is really addressing their questions on the outcomes that they had intended to meet as part of this sub-regional plan, they being the government of Alberta. One of the outcomes that they state they want to meet is a healthy landscape that's intact and protects plants and wildlife and species at risk. And there's literally nothing in the plan that provides any faith that this will actually happen. There is an unwavering devotion to industrial expansion. And I just there's no way that this plan can go forward and we can meet the habitat requirements for healthy caribou, which equal a healthy boreal forest. So there's absolutely no demonstration of their ability to meet those requirements.
You taught me here. I didn't know that we had an agreement with the federal government that expired last October, but I do know that species at risk laws are still in place. So do you see a challenge to these plans at any point, Tara? I know that's a pretty bold question for you, but do you see anybody, taking this to the federal government and asking questions around their capacity to step in here?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And given that this does nothing to meet the requirements under the Species at Risk Act, I don't think it would be unbelievable that there would be a legal challenge on it. The Section 11 agreements were signed between Alberta and Canada, and they agreed to use these subregional plans to prove that they could and would recover caribou habitat. They had a whole list of requirements in them that they had agreed to meet. There was funding behind it from the federal government. As you mentioned, those expired in October, and none of the commitments that were agreed to in that conservation agreement were met within the 5 years. I'm not a lawyer. I can't speak to whether or not there is a case, but this is absolutely going to make it very, very challenging to meet the legal requirements under the Species at Risk Act to recover caribou.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I know you're not a legal expert, so we aren't holding you to that, but I do think it's an important thing to mention that we are. This is breaking species at risk laws, which for anybody who isn't familiar is about those keystone species and ensuring that they are intact and that their ecosystem is stable. So that is a federal law that we be supporting here in Alberta. Again, this also could impact watersheds downstream of this. So this is something that would impact Northwest Territories because we are talking about consuming more water. I'm just going to use some numbers that I like to help people understand. If we are exporting 4 million barrels a day of water, we are simultaneously polluting 4 million barrels a day of net fresh water. We, of course, recycle water in that, but that is a net contamination issue that we have happening. If we're doubling that production, we're doubling that number to 8 million barrels a day, which is obscene. I don't know where they would even store this water. These tailings ponds, many of them are full. There's many things that are at risk with this activity going forward. Anything you want to say in the final comments that you offer for this plan, Tara? There's that last section where you give some overall comments. Anything more to say there?
Yeah, I guess I do want to just go back to what I was saying about the conservation area and the Cold Lake First Nations intentions behind that. I want to mention that there are a number of other First Nations that call the entire subregion home and their traditional territory. And I hope that the Indigenous-led conservation areas and management incorporates all of the nations and communities in that area. I'm most familiar with the Cold Lake First Nations input into that. I know that there are more than just the Cold Lake First Nation really, really engaged and really concerned about caribou survival and recovery. And our intention is always that all of the traditional territories and cultural and traditions are respected in that area. I mean, overall, I'm continually so dismayed and disappointed that the objective of recovering caribou, an iconic Canadian, iconic Albertan species, has been completely stripped from any of these plans. I really truly fear that this plan and all of the next ones that are coming out, and even the Upper Smoky subregional plan, which was just finalized in November, I think they're all going to result in an expedited loss of this species. And I'm so afraid of what that means for the broader health of the boreal forest and all of the other wildlife and people and communities that rely on it functioning. This is one out of what I believe is going to be 11 subregional plans to come out. There has been the mandate letter for the Minister of Environment and Protected Areas an intention to complete all of the subregional plans before the end of their mandate. That's probably going to be this fall. And if they are all this poor quality and completely ignoring the needs of the environment, I think it is going to spell disaster for the ecosystems across Alberta.
Banff Kananaskis one is also under review, and I know we have a group of people that will be following your lead here in trying to do the same engagement work with people down in this neck of the woods. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tara. It is really hard to talk about these things, understanding what you understand and what I do now too. This is key. This is it. To me, this sub-regional planning, our ability to work together to heal our watersheds is the goal that is needed for our province. To me, it is a massive economy that's sitting in wait while this fossil fuel development continues, remembering that we do actually need to stop developing new fossil fuels and start switching to a renewable economy as well. So many of this is moving us further deeper in the wrong direction, which is going to have severe consequences. And I appreciate you helping people understand that today. Anything more you'd like to add before we close?
Just that I know there are so many demands for people's time. Having your voice heard in these engagements is important. And this one closes on April 9th. Our engagement guide can help you through the survey. And please stay tuned, because this is not going to be the end of the regional land use planning engagements over the next few months. So stay strong and don't get burnt out. Yeah, thanks, Jenny.
Thank you. Thank you for the work you did. They've made, CPAWS has made it, and AWA has made it very easy for you to engage with this. Remember, as she said, as Tara said, the deadline is April 9th. Use their guide, make your voice heard. At a minimum, you're saying, I see what you're doing. I stand against it. This will cause irreparable harm, and they need to at least have that on the record from us. So thank you very much for making it easy for people. As you said, they are flooding us with so much information. It's really hard to be able to sift through. This is why groups like CPAWS and AWA are so important for us to, as a broader public, understand what's going on. Yeah. Thank you, Tara. I really appreciate working with you and the opportunity to speak with you today.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. And thanks everyone for listening.